Hi everyone. Okay, so today we are looking at the human impacts on the water cycle and the carbon cycle in the Arctic tundra. And the main activity that we're going to focus on is drilling for oil and gas up in the Arctic. So this YouTube clip here just gives you an overview of the issue we're going to have a look at today in terms of oil and gas extraction. So having a look at Alaska, which is obviously an American state, but have you ever wondered why America owns Alaska, being this state that is not joined on to the rest of mainland America, but is up there as sort of next to Canada, if you like, if you look at the map on the left there. And it's all because of the natural resources. It's all because of the oil and gas. That's why America wanted to own Alaska. That's why they got their hands on it. So let's have a think about this region in terms of what's there and the impacts that extracting oil and gas in this environment might have. So the map at the bottom there, we've got this area called the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, which gets shortened to ANWR, ANWR, ANWR it's called. And that's a refuge, that is a protected area because of its wildlife. But you can also see there up in the north, Prudhoe Bay oil field, and you might have heard of the Trans-Alaska pipeline, which brings the oil down from Alaska down towards the port so that they can then bring that into mainland America. So there's lots of information about oil and gas and expanding what goes on there already in the news at the moment. One of the problems that America has faced actually in extracting the oil from the Arctic has been a lack of sea ice. And actually it's an extremely harsh environment to go into to try to extract oil and gas. And it's very expensive to extract oil and gas from this environment. But we've got to set this against the fact that oil, gas are finite resources. They are running out. And actually, in order to extract any more of them, in terms of new places, it's only going to be the difficult, harsh environments that are left in terms of the oil and gas that we can extract going forward. This is the North Slope of Alaska, and it's an area of wilderness, and it's a protected area. Now, you might look at that and think, why on earth is that protected? How on earth could that be supporting wildlife enough that it should be protected against anything else? It's basically a giant swamp with frozen areas. Do we really need to protect this? They discovered the oil and gas in Prudhoe Bay back in 1968, and there has been this development of this oil and gas industry there since then. And as I mentioned earlier, it's a very challenging place to extract oil and gas. You've got that complete 24 hours of darkness to contend with in the winter. You've got the permafrost, and then you've got the melting of the permafrost in the summer. It's incredibly remote, it's very hard to get to, and we've got this wilderness that lots of people are very keen to protect. But they have gone ahead. There's the pipeline in the picture at the bottom, and this is all because of America's desire to extract their own oil. They would much rather produce their own oil than import it from elsewhere. They want to be independent in terms of their energy supply. So there are pipelines, there are roads, there are power lines, power generators that have been there since the 70s and 80s. And actually there was a time in the 90s where nearly a quarter of America's oil came from the North Slope of Alaska. That's declined massively in recent years, partly because they've come across this shale gas where they pump the really high-powered water and chemicals down into the rocks to release the gases from within the shale rock, and that's accounted for more of their production. So when we look at the last three presidents, if you like, so Barack Obama was very pro the environment, and he banned oil and gas drilling in most of the Arctic and Atlantic oceans. But then obviously when Trump took over, he was the complete opposite. He just wanted to make money for the economy, and he opened it all up again. And actually at the bottom there, this was the 6th of January this year, people were saying that he was having a last minute push to help secure the drilling rights for oil companies in Alaska before he left office. Now Biden obviously was Barack Obama's vice president. He is, if you like, the polar opposite of Donald Trump, very much in the same way that Obama was. And it's going to be interesting to see what he does. He's already said that one of the first acts he will do as president will be to put the United States back into the Paris Climate Change Agreement, which Trump pulled them out of pretty much instantly as he took power back in 2017. So hopefully Biden is going to be much better for the environment than Trump has been. So we need to look at the impacts of this oil and gas industry in Alaska on the carbon cycle and the water cycle. So really we're focusing in on what does it do to the permafrost. And obviously when you put all of that infrastructure in place, it has a melting impact on the permafrost. So you've got the infrastructure, you've got the settlements, you're diffusing heat directly into the environment, and it creates a lot of dust, and that dust makes the snow and ice turn from white into sort of a grey, blacky colour. And we know that white surfaces reflect the sun's rays, whereas these dark, dirty snows then absorb more of the sun's rays, which means the remaining permafrost melts even quicker. And obviously in order to build this infrastructure, they've also had to remove vegetation which used to insulate the permafrost, and so no longer does so. This is a really interesting picture of some permafrost found in Siberia and central Alaska. And if you look carefully, you can see that the permafrost itself, that permanently frozen layer beneath the surface, contains lots of partly decomposed vegetation. And they found grass roots that date back 30,000 years that are still sort of in a frozen state within that permafrost, not having been decomposed. And there's also lots of animal bones within the soil as well. It's a huge carbon reservoir. So obviously when that permafrost melts, it releases carbon dioxide, it releases methane. There's a couple of really good YouTube videos there. It's quite a fun video to show how they know that there's methane in the lakes being released. And I've put those clips on there for you. So we've got lots of carbon coming into the atmosphere from this store in the permafrost. And we've destroyed the vegetation, which means there's even less photosynthesis and carbon being taken out of the atmosphere than there was. And tundra vegetation grows incredibly slowly, so any sort of recovery is going to take a huge amount of time. So what we're seeing is carbon being released from thawing permafrost into the atmosphere, and much less carbon being taken in through the removal of vegetation. So what about the impacts on the water cycle? So with that permafrost thawing, with the snow cover thawing, it obviously means we've got more liquid water. We've got runoff, we've got river discharge. And remember, we've talked about this before, the surface is frozen, it's impermeable. So any running water on the surface is not going to be able to infiltrate. It's going to sit on the surface, it's going to run across the surface. And we've actually seen flooding occurring. So if you think that the ground is made up of 50% ice, 50% soil, and the 50% ice melts and turns into water, you can imagine how much disturbance that creates to the landscape. you've got sort of fluid soil running across the surface. You've got lots of chance for landslides and landslips to take place. So in the summer, we've got lots of wetlands and ponds and lakes that appear on the surface as that permafrost, only the top meter, remember, thaws out. So we do get evaporation taking place. And when we have this mining activity, that creates artificial lakes, which do a similar job and put more water, more moisture into the atmosphere. But they also disrupt the drainage and they expose the surrounding permafrost to further melting. And then you've got roads and you've got the little explosions that they put in place to try to disrupt the oil and gas and bring it to the surface. And all of that can disrupt drainage. And then they extract water from the rivers and creeks to use within the process of mining the oil and gas. And I'm not sure if anybody's ever watched that program, Ice Road Truckers, where the truckers come into the area and they have to build them these special roads made out of ice. And in order to build those ice roads on a yearly basis, they have to take water from the local rivers and creeks in order to be able to build those smooth ice roads that the truckers use to bring the oil and gas out towards the port and towards the industries in the mainland America. And then you've got lots of sediment that's also being washed into the river systems and lots of pollution that is associated with this industry that gets into the water. This was an image that was on Twitter, was it last year or maybe the year before? And if you look carefully, it's a sledge being pulled by dogs. And obviously that would normally take place on smooth ice. But if you look carefully at the image, it looks like it's thawing and it looks like they are running on water rather than ice. And that's quite a stark image to show what is actually happening in this region. And there's a couple of other clips on there that you can have a look at to see the impacts of the melting permafrost. So you've got Horn Lake there at the top. Methane is being released from the water through bubbling. And then you've got what we call the thermokarsts. So this is where permafrost semi-permanently thaws out, which leads to essentially the surface collapsing. So like we were saying before, if you've got 50% ice, 50% soil, and the 50% ice turns to water, you get basically a collapse in the surface. And there's a thaw slump there image at the bottom you can have a look at on that YouTube video. This is another clip to show a landslide which is actually sweeping away the buildings in Norway, all associated with the permafrost thawing. So now we need to look at the management strategies that are being used by the oil and gas industry in the tundra. So in the past, what they've done is basically deliberately destroyed the permafrost. They've thawed the permafrost. So when they've looked at the impacts that they're having, they've noticed that the main thing that they can do in terms of managing their impact is to actually try and protect the permafrost. So there are lots of strategies that they've put in place to try to protect that permafrost and stop it from actually thawing out. So these are some of the ideas that they've put into place. So for example, actually putting insulated ice and gravel pads onto the roads so that you are protecting that permafrost from the cars driving, from the lorries driving over it. So you've got this sort of protective layer in between the actual vehicle and the permafrost. Another thing that they've done is they put the buildings and the pipelines onto stilts. You can see in that second picture down. And this allows the cold air to circulate beneath, which then protects the permafrost below, rather than having that pipeline sitting on the surface, melting the permafrost. They've looked at ways that they can drill laterally, so sideways from the drilling platforms. So they can get the oil and gas several kilometres from the drill site. So they don't need as many drill sites, so they're not having as much impact on the permafrost. And they've used their powerful computer models to actually detect where the gas and oil is within the rocks, rather than exploring, putting these exploration wells in to see if they do strike oil, they do strike gas. They can actually use computer models to actually find where it is, rather than having to have lots of sites and destroying the permafrost. And the Trans-Alaskan pipeline actually has refrigerated supports. So they actually cool the pipeline to the temperature of permafrost so that it's not having an impact on the environment. And you can see in that bottom picture there, the snow and ice is still there because of this refrigerated pipeline. So there are lots of management methods that they have taken in the tundra to reduce the impacts of the oil and gas industry on the actual permafrost itself and therefore the environment. So these are just some notes that you can just add. I'm not sure I don't think these are in your booklet. So what we need to know is that the human actions in the tundra, when compared to the Amazon rainforest, are very small scale. Because it's such a harsh climate, such a difficult environment, this has massively limited what humans can do in the area. Melting permafrost is also as a result of climate change, not just because of the oil and gas industry. It's very difficult to quantify how much of that melting has been down to oil and gas as opposed to climate change itself. And in the future, as the climate continues to warm and becomes less harsh, it's quite likely that human activity will increase. So we are likely to see that impact get greater. But in terms of thinking about a comparison between human impact in the tundra and human impact in the rainforest, which do you think is the greater impact, and how would you justify that argument? So you might have made some notes as you've gone along. That's absolutely fine. Just need you to check that you have covered these 5 sections. So why is the oil and gas industry in the Arctic challenging? What infrastructure had they put in place? How has it impacted the carbon cycle, the water cycle? And then summarise the management strategies that are being used. And once you've done your notes, I'd then like you to complete test 2 for me, please. So I've uploaded it as a PDF. So you can type your notes onto a Word document, your answers onto a Word document and send it to me, upload it for me on Show My Homework. Or you can write out your answers. But could you please just try to make sure that if you're uploading written out answers, they are clear and that I can read them without straining my eyes. That would be really helpful.